As Marlon said, I'm now the director of the Kinder Institute for Urban Research at Rice in Houston. The Kinder Institute is dedicated to both research on urban issues and channeling that research into practice so it makes a difference in the real world, focusing on Houston, but also with a national and international footprint. So one of the reasons why I wanted to bring Steve Klineberg to LA is because it is our aspiration that the Kinder Institute will be one of the preeminent urban think tanks dealing with issues associated with the Sun Belt in the United States. Houston and Los Angeles are the two largest cities in the Sun Belt, and they share, there are some things they don't share: mountains, weather, there's this ocean thing you have here. But there are a lot of things they do share. They, both in terms of their urban form and in kind of where they are in the trajectory of urban life. As Steve will tell you, Houston is, has been diversifying ethnically dramatically. Like LA, Houston is this giant grid on a flat plain with a freeway system over it and just beginning to urbanize with light rail and so forth. So I think there are a lot of lessons that Houston and LA can learn from each other. And curiously enough, when I got to Rice, I realized Rice University is right on a light rail line that comes southwest out of downtown, just like USC. So there's some pretty interesting comparisons. And so I hope that in the discussion, we can talk about some of the similarities and differences between LA and Houston and how that can inform both of us in both these cities and how that can inform how we deal with urban policy throughout the Sun Belt of the United States. So let me now introduce Steve Klineberg. Steve Klineberg is a longtime professor of sociology at Rice, and he is the founding director of the Kinder Institute. Steve, I'm going to try to remember this right. Went to Haverford, got your Ph.D. at Harvard, taught at Princeton, and has taught at Rice for more years than you care to remember. I can tell you that Steve Klineberg is perhaps the most beloved figure in Houston. I have yet to meet anyone in Houston who doesn't know Steve, and I have yet to meet anyone in Houston who has compared me favorably to him. Steve's going to talk about the Houston Area Survey, among other things, the longest running, most important longitudinal survey of opinion among residents in any American city, really in the history of the United States. A really remarkable accomplishment. And in that way, I think he will probably frame some issues that will lead to some useful discussion about LA and Houston. Having been in Houston since the early 70s, Steve has witnessed really dramatic change in the nature of Houston, both in its ethnic change, in its economy, and also in its shift from a suburban to an urban place. Quite similar to LA, actually, different industries, but other than that, pretty similar. So I'm really glad you were here today, and I look forward to talking with you about the similarities and differences between LA and Houston. How many of you are from Houston or have ever lived there? Anybody? One, two. How many of you? Three. Oh, Marlon went to Rice. That's right.
Okay.
I forgot.
I have lived there, yes.
Marlon went to Rice. I forgot.
Yeah.
How many of you have ever been to Houston ever? Still not so many. Okay. And for those of you who are into planning academics, ACSP will be in Houston this fall. So it's really been an eye-opener to me to move there after 30 years in California and learn about these similarities and differences. So I'll turn it over to Steve now.
Thank you, Bill. Well, thank you all so much. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here and a chance to share with you what we think we've learned from 33 years of systematic surveys in Houston. We began back in 1982. I was a very young man, just teaching a research methods class to sociology majors. Houston was booming. 1 million people had moved into Houston between 1970 and 1982. Coming at the rate of 1,380 people a week, 230 cars and trucks every day being added to the streets and freeways of Harris County, the greatest boom anyone had ever seen, brought about by the tenfold increase in the value of oil. Houston was a one industry town. 82% of all the jobs in Houston in 1980 were tied into the price of oil, and a barrel of oil increased tenfold in value between 1970 and 1980. You guys are having your stagflating 70s. Houston was booming. Let me see if I can get this to work. And it was a city also this is of course the Spindletop, right? It was also a city world famous for having imposed the least amount of controls on development of any city in the Western world. No zoning, who cares if it smells? It's the smell of money, come on down. Growing concerns in the city about traffic, pollution, crime. One-time survey, a friend of mine just started a new survey organization. We got the students involved in measuring the social costs of growth, right? What kind of, all this exhilarating economic development, what kind of city are we building? It was a one-time survey, never occurred to us to do it again. 2 months later, the oil boom collapsed. The price of oil had been at $32.50, fell down to $28, but Houston had been building and borrowing on the basis of $50 oil, and 100,000 jobs were lost in Houston by the end of 1983. We said, my gosh, we better do this survey again. And for 33 years, we're now in the midst of the 34th year, my students and I have been taking a representative random sample of Harris County residents, asking people with identical questions over the years, how do you see the world? What is happening in your life? And we have sat back and watched the world change. Houston went into major recession, the worst regional recession of any part of the country at any time since World War II, and then recovered into a restructured economy and a demographic revolution. And these are the transformations occurring across all of America. Very clear in LA, we think of Houston as LA's little brother. We're having the same, but as Bill said, we're very similar kinds of cities at the forefront of the demographic and economic transformations that are occurring across all of America. Nowhere we think more clearly seen or more sharply articulated than in Houston, Texas. This is the 30 years after World War II. America emerged out of that war the sole economic power on the planet. All of our potential competitors were decimated by the war experience. 38% of the jobs in Houston, in America, were union jobs. The unions could negotiate with the corporations to ensure that workers shared in the prosperity of the companies. And the poorest 20% of American families more than doubled their incomes in those 30 years after World War II. The richest 5% doubled theirs. Those were the years when the rising tide lifted all boats. The average American man, whatever his job was, literally doubled his income between 1950 and 1970. And those, of course, were the years when we celebrated the stay-at-home housewife mother in suburbia. The average American woman gave birth to 3.6 children, and the baby boom was launched upon the land. Preceded and followed by baby bust generations. So for 60 years, it's been this bulge going through the system. Demographers talk about it like a pig being swallowed by a python. Not very healthy either for the pig or the python. The leading edge of those 76 million babies turned 69 this year. And we are going to watch, as Dowell reminds us powerfully in his work, a literal doubling in the number of Americans over the age of 65. By 2030, the youngest of those 76 million babies will have turned 65. They are overwhelmingly Anglo babies, heading off into the sunset, leaving an America that is quite different in its demographic composition, in its preparation for the jobs of the 21st century, and so on. So that the epic transformation of our time is this transformation as Anglos increasingly age out of the system, and younger people are disproportionately non-Anglo, multi-ethnic, that are preparing for a very different world. Here is the last 30 years, when virtually all the benefits of economic growth have gone to the richest 5%. The poorest 20% of American families are poorer today than they were 30 years ago. And the bottom 60% of American families have basically stagnated and gone down, and all the benefits have gone to the richest 5%, most of that to the richest 1%. A whole bunch of things happening, but the basic secular patterns here are twofold. Number one, globalization. Fareed Zakaria said it best in his book, The Post-American World. What we're dealing with in the world today is not the decline of the West. The West is not declining. It's the rise of the rest. We are in a worldwide global economy. Companies can produce goods anywhere, sell them everywhere. If you are doing a job that I can train a third world worker to do, and I pay that third world worker $10 a day to do that job, I'm not going to pay you $10 an hour. And if you are doing a job that I can program a computer to do, I'm going to replace your job with an intelligent machine. We are suddenly in a new world where the good blue-collar jobs have disappeared, and education has become the critical determinant of a person's ability to earn enough money to support a family in the global knowledge economy of the 21st century. And we ask people, How important is it to get for a person to be successful in today's world? Is it necessary to get education beyond high school, or are there many ways to succeed with no more than a high school diploma? And in the total sample in our survey last year, 3/4 of all Houstonians recognize you've got to get education beyond high school. I tell people the most important institution of higher education in Houston is not Rice University, wonderful and important as Rice is, it's the community college system. That's where we take kids coming out of high school with no skills and connect them to the technical jobs of the 21st century. I fight a losing battle with people who say if only those Latinos and Asians and African Americans valued education the way the Asians and the Anglos do, we would have no problem. So I can break it down by ethnicity, and here's what you find. Blacks and Hispanics, even more than Asians and much more than Anglos, understand the critical importance of education. They know that you've got to get education beyond high school to get a decent job. If they're not getting that education, it is demonstrably not because they don't value education or understand its importance. It's because of concentrated poverty. It's because Houston is the single most segregated city in America by income, and the 6th most segregated by ethnicity. We live in separate little enclaves where the poor are isolated in overcrowded, underfunded inner city schools. One of the big movements at Houston now is to try to get universal preschool education for every child, because rich kids start kindergarten 1.5 to 2 years ahead of poor kids. The moment of truth in high school, they tell me, the moment of truth in education is 3rd grade reading. If you're not reading at 3rd grade level in 3rd grade, if you haven't made the transition from learning to read to reading to learn, and you're not reading at 3rd grade level in 3rd grade, you are 4.5 times more likely to drop out of high school. And the single most powerful predictor whether you can read in 3rd grade level is, did you start kindergarten ready to learn to read? So it's a recognition that education is now critical, and African Americans and Latinos understand that at least as much as does anyone else. So theme number 1, and I'm going to touch on this, a lot of aspects of this. Theme number 1 is a growing inequality across America, predicated above all else on access to quality education. What you earn depends on what you have learned in the new world of the 21st century. Theme number 2 is this truly extraordinary demographic transformation that's occurred across all of America, and again, I think nowhere more clearly seen than in Houston. Why here? Why now? Here's a quick summary of American history. There's a number of immigrants coming to America in each of the decades of the 1820s to 2000s. We were a nation of immigrants, right? Irish first, then Germans and French, and then of course 15.9 million Southern and Eastern Europeans, Italians, Greeks, Poles coming between 1890 and 1914. And then for 50 years, virtually no immigration. Combination of a deeply racist law, the 1924 National Origins Quota Act that sought to allow only Northern Europeans to come to America. And then of course the Great Depression in the 1930s and World War II. And for 50 years, no immigration. The law that was restricting immigration to America was changed in 1965 with right after the assassination of Kennedy. Last book that Kennedy wrote, posthumously published, was Immigrant America, a celebration of the great contribution that immigrants have made to this country. We had stopped all immigration virtually for 50 years. The law was changed in 1965, said, okay, we used to be a racist nation, we're not racist anymore, we'll give every country recognized by the UN 20,000 visas a year, but we'll continue the hallmark of American immigration policy, family reunification. We're in the business of reuniting families. If you're the father, mother, sister, brother, son or daughter of an American citizen, you can come to the head of the line. And also in 1965, the Congress was playing with the law and said, well, if you're a professional of exceptional abilities, or if you have skills that are demonstrably needed in short supply, you too can come to the head of the line. And in its debates in the 50s and early 60s, Congress was saying, we need to open the door for some more British doctors, some more German engineers. It never occurred to anyone that there were going to be African doctors, Indian engineers, Chinese computer programmers who would be able for the first time in the 20th century to come to America. The law was changed in 1965. It's been called one of the great inadvertent acts that the US Congress has ever passed, in a body known for its inadvertent acts and its unintended consequences. The world changed, totally unexpected. During the 1960s, about 3.5 million immigrants came to this country. Only 38% were from Europe. Well, let me back up for a minute. The big story here, right, is between 1492 and 1965. 82% of all the human beings on the face of this earth who came to American shores came from Europe. 82%. Another 12% were Africans, originally brought here as slaves to serve the Europeans. And there was a handful of Chinese and Japanese working as farmers and laborers in California and Hawaii. This nation, throughout all of our history, had been an amalgam of European nationalities. And 88% of all the immigration that has come since 1965, as we've become a nation of immigrants again, 88% is coming from Asia, Latin America, Africa, and the Caribbean. And the United States, that throughout all of our history been an amalgam of European nationalities, is becoming a microcosm of the world. The first nation in history that can say we are a free people and we come from everywhere. And it's a remarkable change, happening at the same moment as American economy is becoming fully integrated, single global economy. So during the 1960s, 3.5 million people came, only 38% were from Europe. In the 1970s, 5 million came, only 18% were Europeans. 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, about 10 million immigrants per decade have been coming to America, 88% coming from everywhere else on the planet except from Europe. And immigration is network driven, so it's not happening at the same rate everywhere. There are two cities, Los Angeles, of course, and New York, that are the great immigration capitals of America. Still today, about 1/3 of all the foreign-born residents of the United States live in and around those two great cities, Los Angeles and California, followed by lesser magnet gateway cities, Miami, San Francisco, Chicago, Houston, followed right after Houston by San Diego, Washington, D.C., Dallas, Boston, Atlanta, spreading out to every city and town across America. No city has been transformed as fully, as completely, as suddenly, as unexpectedly, as totally out of the blue as Houston, Texas. This city, throughout all of its history, had been a biracial southern city dominated and controlled in an automatic, taken for granted way by white men. And in the space of the last 30 years has become the single most ethnically diverse major metropolitan area in the country. Here are the census figures. For the 3 decades during the oil boom years, there was our biracial world in Harris County, Texas in 1960. 74% of us were Anglos, 20% African Americans, just 6% Hispanics, less than 0.5% were Asians. During the oil boom years of the 60s and 70s, it was Anglos pouring into Houston from everywhere else in the country. This is where the jobs were while you guys were having your Carter Malaise and your stagflating 70s. And by 1980, Houston became the 4th largest city in America, having surpassed Philadelphia. Still an overwhelmingly Anglo city, 63% Anglo, 20% African American, 16% Hispanic, 2% Asian. After the oil bust of 1982, that fateful date, the Anglo population of Harris County stopped growing. And all the growth of this, the most rapidly growing city in America, all of it has been the influx of African Americans, Latinos, and Asians. And here are the last 3 decades, and there's the story, right? The Anglo population has dropped. Fewer Anglos in 2000 and 1990 than in 2010 than 2000. Fewer in 2020 than 1990. African American population growing at the same rate as the county as a whole, about 20% per decade, fueled by African and Jamaican immigration, fueled by the great remigration of middle-class African Americans from northern cities back to southern cities. Atlanta first, Houston second, growing at the same rate as the population as a whole, and then surging populations of Latinos and Asians. And by 2010, Harris County was now 41% Latino, 33% Anglo, 18% African American, 8% Asian. So 2 points I'd like to make here. Number one, just imagine how different the story of Houston would have been if that city had not turned out to be one of the magnets for the new immigration of the last 30 years. Houston would have lost population. It would have had the same fate as other major American cities across the country that are losing their status as major cities because for 30 years they have stopped growing. Philadelphia, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, St. Louis, Detroit, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Buffalo. Instead, Houston and LA and Miami and those few others are booming in their economy, booming in their population, purely because of this influx of African Americans, Latinos, and Asians. And so I tell people, just, no city has benefited more from immigration than Houston, Texas, when you think about it. And it's ironic but not surprising to see anti-immigrant attitudes in Houston when you think about how different the story of that city would have been had Houston been like Philadelphia and for one reason or another never become a magnet for the new immigration. And theme number 2 is that Houston does seem to have, there's a sociologist have an index called the entropy index, which asks how close does a population come to 1/4 Asian, 1/4 Latino, 1/4 African American, 1/4 Anglo. And Houston comes closer than any other major city in America. Here's a comparison. This is Greater Houston metropolitan area with the New York area, Los Angeles. New York has too many Anglos, right? and many fewer Latinos. Los Angeles has very few African Americans relative to the other communities. Miami has very few Asians. Houston is where the four communities meet in greater balance, greater equality. Right down the southwest of us is Fort Bend County, just southwest of Sugar Land and Missouri City and a few other cities that is just to the southwest of Harris County. Fort Bend County, we think, is the most ethnically diverse county in the world. Fort Bend County today is 19% Asian, 23% Latino, 21% African American, 36% Anglo. You can't get much closer to 1/4, 1/4, 1/4, 1/4. And that's an interesting kind of dynamic that is a part of what Houston is and will be, and as a kind of a forerunner of what's coming throughout all of America. Here's another way to picture this. This is Harris County in 1980. There were 243 census tracts in Harris County, and in blue are all the census tracts that were majority Anglo. In 1980, right? In red are the census tracts that were majority African American. That's what's known as the 3rd Ward and the 5th Ward. This African American corridor. Keep your eye on this, by the way. It's not going to change for the next 40 years. The hyper-segregation of blacks that continues in the inner city of Houston. And then along the ship channel was what they called the Segundo Barrio, the 2nd Ward, where the Latinos were, and in a very few places in that sort of olive color around the Beltway where there was no majority. Okay, so this is Harris County in 1980. Here it is in 1990. So the surging populations, Latinos are heading north and east, and then around the Beltway, more and more of these census tracts with no majority. Here it is in 2000, and here it is today. Isn't that incredible, right? With no one having planned this, no one consulted with me before all these people came, Houston finds itself at the forefront of the demographic transformation that is occurring across all of America. Nowhere, I think, more sharply seen and articulated than in Houston, because Houston, Los Angeles has had immigration for a long time. New York, Chicago. Houston never had foreign immigrants. Houston had migrants coming from everywhere else in the country to Houston, suddenly becoming a magnet for all the new immigration of the 21st century. And it's not just numbers, it's also, of course, ages, coming back to what I'd said at the beginning. So here is babies on the left and old folks on the right. And here are 12 different age categories going from less than 5 to more than 75 years old. And here, somewhat to my chagrin, is where the Anglos are in Houston. Welcome, I introduced you to the baby boom, right? There they are. It's not until you reach people over the age of 63 in Harris County today that a majority of folks are still Anglos. At each younger age group, the percentage of Anglos plummets. The percentage of African Americans, Asians, and above all Latinos surges, and here's where everybody else is. So that's a powerful picture of who we are and where we're heading, right? So of everybody in Harris County under the age of 20, 19 and younger, 51, and this is all of Harris County, so it's not the school district that is the HISD, that is Houston Independent School District, that is overwhelmingly African American Latino, 85% qualify for reduced cost of free lunch programs. This is all of Harris County. Of everybody in Harris County under the age of 20, 51% are Latinos, 19% are African American, 9% are Asian, 22% are Anglos. So 2 statements to make. Number 1, it is a safe statement to make that if Houston's African American and Latino young people are unprepared to succeed in the knowledge economy of the 21st century, it is hard, if not impossible, to envision a prosperous future for Houston. That is who we are and will be as the 21st century unfolds. And the other point to make is that this is a done deal. Close the borders, build your fence. Not another immigrant ever again will be allowed to come to these shores. We're going to close off America. 60-year-old Anglos are not going to be making a whole lot more babies. I tell people we'll do the best we can. We'll work at every chance we get. So I tell you, you can go to the bank on this, right? No force in the world is going to stop Houston or Los Angeles or America from becoming more Latino, more African American, more Asian, and less Anglo as the 21st century unfolds. Nothing in the world can stop that. So the only question this generation has been given, Okay, how do we make this work? How do we ensure that this ethnic diversity becomes a tremendous asset that can be for cities like Los Angeles and New York as the gateways to the global economy, and ensure that it doesn't end up tearing us apart and becoming a major liability, reducing rather than enhancing our competitiveness in the global economy? Much depends on how this generation speaks of this remarkable convergence of these two fundamental revolutions that have transformed the nature of America in the 21st century. So this is Houston. Let me just show you very quickly. This is Texas. I need one of these for California. I haven't done this yet. Here is Texas, virtually the same as Houston, right? It's a couple years behind. Houston, Texas and California, the two largest states in the Union, both of which are now overwhelmingly majority minority states with that same pattern, right? And here is the United States today, still an Anglo country. There's the same categories, right? There they go, but the same pattern of the baby boom, older Anglos, or Anglos disproportionately among the older folks and less among the younger. Here's where everybody else is in 2012. And census announced actually a year later, all of our estimates tell us now that across all of America, of everybody under the age of 6, the majority are now African American, Latino, and Asian. And then because of the damn actuarial tables, the census says, we can tell you what America will look like in 2050, assuming no new immigration. Immigration has ended. Just actuarial tables of life expectancy. Here is the United States in 2050. And that's basically Los Angeles and New York today. So it's a fair statement to make. How these cities navigate this transition will have enormous significance, not just for the Houston future, but for the American future. This is one of the cities where the American future is going to be worked out. And it's what makes, I think, all of our efforts and commitments as we work together to build this new world for our cities of transcendent importance, because this is where we'll see what all of America will look like. By 2045, all of America will look like Houston today. So this is where that future is now, an opportunity to really think through how are we doing and how do we make sure it works. And then I want to show a few other quick things here. One is, of course, the new immigration is unprecedented in American history in two fundamental respects. Number one, of course, it is non-European. Remember, right? Never, ever before in the history of America were non-Europeans allowed to come here in any meaningful numbers. We froze America to ensure that it remained just for the superior species of humanity, Northern Europeans, basically. And so suddenly it's a non-European immigration. And secondly, it is remarkably bifurcated. One group of immigrants are coming with higher levels of educational credentials, of professional skills than we have ever seen in the history of immigration to America. And one group is coming with stunning educational deficits relative to the average education of the average American. Here are the Asians. So this is less than high school degree, some college degree, postgraduate education beyond the 4 years of high school. 66% of all Asian immigrants in Houston have college degrees, compared to 40% of all Anglos. So when you ask Anglos, how come Asians are doing so well, you get a variant of what's called the model minority myth, right? Asians came here with nothing, no money, no education, no command of English, and by virtue of hard work, strong family values, and high intelligence, they have succeeded. Proof America's a land of opportunity for anybody with the right kinds of values. And by implication or explicitly, if you blacks and Hispanics aren't making it, you've got no one to blame but yourselves. Look at the Asians. And when you look at the Asians, you discover that they are coming from educational backgrounds that are far superior to the average background of the average Anglo across America and in Houston. And then here are the US-born blacks. About 1/5 are high school dropouts, about 1/5 have college degrees. US-born Latinos, 1/4 are high school dropouts. And here are the Latino immigrants, 59% without high school. And that's what scares people, right? And they're never learning English. They're making all these demands on our resources. They're coming with no skills. They're going to become dependent. They're taking our jobs. And we have now reached a large enough number of Latinos in our surveys that we can address this question. We have reached 4,800 US-born Latinos and 4,400 Latino immigrants. So we can ask the question, what happens to Latino immigrants the longer they are in this country? Do they ever make it out of poverty? Do they ever learn English? Do they break out of the co-ethnic enclaves? And then compare them. So we have three groups of Latino immigrants. Those who have been in the United States for 9 years or less, 10 to 19 years, 20 years or longer. And then compare them to second generation Latinos, born in this country of immigrant parents, and third generation, born in this country of parents who were also born here in America. Let me just, as quickly as I can, show some of this pattern. Here's education, no improvement, right? Because that's the great bugaboo. And what's striking is that second and third generation have much more education than immigrants, but third generation is doing no better than second generation. The blockage that comes from inadequate access to quality education. But with no education or very low levels of education, they are indeed working their way out of poverty. The longer they're here, the less likely they are to be working as in day labor or in production jobs. Personal earnings go from 33% making more than $25,000 to over half among immigrants who've been here for 20 years or less. Strikingly, Latino immigrants are working their way out of poverty at least as fast as the Italians and the Greeks and the Poles did 100 years ago when the same concerns were being expressed about them. And what about interethnic friendships? Do they ever get out of their co-ethnic enclaves the longer they're here? So do you have a close personal friend who's Anglo? Do you have a close personal friend who's African American? Do you have a close personal friend who's Asian? And again, those 5 different communities. And it's about as consistent and robust a finding as you can get. The longer you're in America, the more you move into and become close to and comfortable with the multi-ethnic diversity that is Houston, Texas today. And then we asked, of course, about romantic relations. Have you ever been involved in a romantic relationship with someone who was not Latino? And the same sort of pattern, right? And then of people who were married, we said, what is your spouse's ethnicity? And almost 30% of all married third-generation Latinos are married to non-Latinos. We're heading into what sociologists are sometimes calling a transracial world. Multi-ethnic babies being produced all over the place. We sociologists hate this because we want to put people in the nice, clear, mutually exclusive categories, and we're getting messed up with this incredible diversity that's happening. Something like of all Asian marriages in the last 3 years, 34% involved a non-Asian. Right? And so it's a striking new reality that's coming. And Latino immigrants, the longer they're here, the more they're involved in that. And then we've been, part of the great strength of these surveys is that we're asking identical questions, exactly the same wording, in the same place in the questionnaire, with the samples drawn exactly the same way in February and March of each of the years. And here are just 3 examples of questions we've asked about in 2010, 2012, and 2014. Here's a 10-point scale where 1 means very unfavorable feelings and 10 means very favorable feelings. Where on this scale would you characterize your feelings about undocumented immigrants in America today? And here's what you find. Went from 31, 35, 45% in 2014. Then we said, are you in favor opposed to granting illegal immigrants a path of legal citizenship if they speak English and have no criminal record? Again, significant increasing support or decreasing antagonism as we go forward. And then more generally, do immigrants to the US today generally contribute more to the American economy than they take, or do they take more than they contribute? And the percent saying that immigrants contribute more than they take goes from 45 to 49 to 59% in the latest survey. So again, a robust finding that tells us, we are in the midst of as we all know, just intolerable failure to address immigration policies, right? 10 million people working here, many for 20, 30 years, with American kids, locked in the shadows. Men can be cheated out of their wages. Women can be attacked and raped. Kids are terrified there's going to be a raid on Shipley's Donuts, and my mother might not be there when I come home from school. Finally, you have a sense the American public, at least, is really prepared to support comprehensive immigration reform and an ethical way to address these new realities. And then I want to just touch on a few of the differences within the communities. The single most powerful predictor among Anglos of comfort with diversity is age. And here's just one sort of fun question. As I mentioned, we asked it of everybody. Have you ever been involved in a romantic relationship with someone who was not Anglo? And of Anglos under the age of 45 or 50, about 50% said, thank you for asking. Yes, indeed, I have. And here it is for us older Anglos. Powerful reminder that we older Anglos grew up in a different world. The world of the 60s and 70s was a different place from the world of the 1990s and 2000s. And there's a law of human nature that says what I am familiar with feels right and natural. What I'm unfamiliar with feels unnatural and somehow not quite right. And every measure we have shows this pattern among Anglos with age. So here are just 3 examples from last year's survey. 78% of all the Anglo respondents who were under the age of 30, 78% said the increasing ethnic diversity in Houston brought about by immigration is on balance a good thing for the city, but only 56% of those over 60. Do you support granting illegal immigrants a path to legal citizenship? And then particularly striking, I think 72% of all the Anglos under 30 say the increasing immigration into this country today mostly strengthens American culture. And 59% of all Anglos over 60 say the immigration mostly threatens American culture. Not surprising. We are living at a revolutionary, radical transformation, a time when the world is a different place today than it was 20 or 30 years ago. And I tell people, you've got to be gentle with us older Anglos. This is a big change, a very short amount of time, but we're getting there. And you have this sense of younger Anglos who just, what's the big deal here? Growing up in a world where that reality is just taken for granted. And then among African Americans, a particularly interesting finding, I think. The world is filled with what psychologists call motivated beliefs. We are motivated to believe things that make us feel comfortable about ourselves. So if I'm successful and wealthy as an Anglo, I am motivated to believe that anyone can make it in America if they're willing to work hard. And if they're not making it, it's because they're not trying, or they don't have the right kind of values, they're not willing to work hard. If I'm poor, I'm equally motivated to believe people are poor because of circumstances they can't control. Right? That pattern of supporting and then of supporting government programs to help the poor. If you're poor, you're in favor of that. That's exactly the pattern you find among Anglos. You find it to some degree among Latinos. You do not find it among African Americans. Let me just show you a few examples of that. Here's a question that said, do you think government should do more to solve our country's problems, or is government doing too much that should be left to individuals and businesses? So I've got 4 categories of income. Among Anglos, first, it's less than 25 to 75,000 or more, and they're Hispanics, and in both cases, there's the pattern, right? 36% of the less successful, poorer Anglos are saying government should do more, but only 22% of the successful Anglos, right? And the same thing with US-born Hispanics, no pattern, no tendency at all among blacks. And then are you in favor or opposed to support, or do you support, favor or opposed to federal health insurance to cover the medical expenses of all Americans? There's the same pattern, nothing among African Americans. Okay, let's try something else. Let's try assessments of discrimination. How often is your ethnic group discriminated against in Houston? Percent who say very or fairly often drops dramatically by income, right? Not among blacks. And then how often have you personally felt discriminated against in Houston because of your ethnicity? Dropping off among Anglos, not so much among Hispanics, not at all among African Americans. And underlying all of this, of course, is politics, right? The key distinction between Republicans and Democrats is what is the role of government. And Republicans tend to believe that the free enterprise system does things right and government is the problem. Poor folks are much more likely to believe that government has an affirmative role to play in economic and social justice. So you look so we ask people, are you Republican, Democrat, Independent, or something else? And then if they say something else or independent, we said, do you consider yourself to be closer to the Republican Party or the Democratic Party? So here are the US-born Anglos in those 4 income categories. So they start out as Anglos. I'm sorry, the Anglos start out as Republicans and become more Republican the more money they make. Latinos start out as Democrats and don't become Republicans until they're making $75,000 or more. And African Americans never become Republicans. Right? And it's a very interesting kind of dynamic that underlies this experience, the differential experience of being in America and having different historical underpinnings to their lives. And then we ask the same question about what about the younger African Americans growing up in a different kind of country today, and that same pattern, striking 68% of African Americans under the age of 30 said they've been involved in a romantic relationship with someone who was not African American, but that is down to 50% for those under the age of 50. And then here it is again for older African Americans, very similar pattern. Again, a powerful reminder, older African Americans grew up in the 50s and 60s and 70s. That was a different world than growing up in the 90s and 2000s. And so when you look at differences by generation and age, blacks and other minorities have the same opportunities as whites in the US today. Younger African Americans believe that more than older ones. Black people in the US are still a long way from having the same chance in life. Alternate view, older African Americans believe that much more than younger. Do you think the criminal justice system in Houston is biased against blacks, biased in favor of blacks, or does it give blacks fair treatment? Just a striking pattern of increasing. The older you are, the earlier your generation of African Americans, the more convinced you are about the realities of discrimination and the barriers that they represent to opportunity for African Americans. And then what's interesting is that how often have you personally felt discriminated against? No difference. So what's happening, I think, is that younger African Americans experience discrimination, experience racism. There are racists among us, and they encounter that, but they no longer see it as quite the degree of a barrier to achievement and opportunity as older Anglos. And it's an interesting kind of a reminder again of how very different all these communities are as they come of age together in the America of the 21st century. So theme number 2 is this remarkable demographic transformation. And theme number 3, very quickly, which we have to talk about, is quality of place that has suddenly become critical to Houston's efforts to position itself for prosperity. As I mentioned at the beginning, who cared if it smells? So what if it's ugly? This is Houston, this is the oil boom. Suddenly Houston is doing all kinds of things to try to position itself to become what is going to be the source of Houston's wealth in the 21st century. Houston's location in the East Texas oil fields that counted for everything in Houston's wealth in the 20th century is going to count for less and less, and eventually for zilch in the 21st century. What will be the source of Houston's wealth? The answer is biotech. We have the largest medical complex in the world. Bio-nanotech, with nanotechnology at Rice and superconductivity at U of H. Bio-nano-infotech, bio-nano-info-envirotech. The source of wealth for cities like Houston in the 21st century will have to do with attracting the best and the brightest people in America, working at the cutting edge of knowledge, able to put that knowledge into commercial ventures, because knowledge will be the source of wealth in the 21st century. The resource of the knowledge economy is housed between the ears of the best and the brightest people in America who can live anywhere. And suddenly, quality of life issues that were never important for Houston have become central to the pro-growth agenda for that city as it positions itself for, Houston has to turn itself into a destination of choice, a place where people can live anywhere will say, I want to live in Houston, Texas. And you may not realize this, I think you probably do, that's a stretch for Houston. Very few people say, I want to live in Houston. But more and more things are happening. Here's just some one just quick example. I think one of the transformative events in Houston's history happened 2 years ago, when the citizens of Houston, by 69%, voted to tax ourselves $100 million, to be matched by $150 million in private monies, to take the bayous, right? Houston's known as Bayou City, these 10 bayous that go in all different directions, that in typical Houston fashion in the 70s and 80s were concretized in the cheapest possible way by the Army Corps of Engineers to serve as drainage ditches for our flooding problems. That's what we did in Houston. No one thought of these as amenities. No one made any connections to the street. This was, we got a flooding problem. We're going to concretize the bayous to get the water out of here as fast as possible. We voted to build 250 miles of linear park space along all 10 of those bayous to connect them so that half of all Houstonians will be within 3/4 of a mile of green space. And Houston is becoming a green city in a way that would have been unimaginable 10 or 15 years ago. One of the most interesting parts, and something that Bill had touched on just earlier, is, and it's exactly what LA has except in spades, is that Houston is maybe the most spread out, the least dense, the most automobile-dependent city in America. And here is just one example that this is the city of Houston. The city of Houston, it covers 600 square miles. It has a grand total of 2 million people in the city limits. You know how big 600 square miles is? You could put inside the city limits of Houston, Texas simultaneously, I kid you not, the cities of Chicago, Baltimore, Detroit, and Philadelphia. Those 4 cities cover the same geographical space as the city of Houston. And they have between them 5.5 million people. Houston, the city of Houston, has 2 million. And then you go to the greater Houston metropolitan area, the 9-county CMSA of Houston. And there's Harris County in the middle. There's that Fort Bend County I was mentioning down the southwest. 9,400 square miles to the CMSA of Houston. You know how big that is? That is almost as big as the entire state of Massachusetts, and considerably bigger than the state of New Jersey. This is the blob that ate East Texas, right? Houston was built on a crummy little bayou, 50 miles from any natural barrier in any direction. No mountains, no forests, no rivers, a developer's dream, built by, for, and on behalf of the automobile, made possible by air conditioning, and the city spread everywhere. And it has created a civilization totally predicated on the automobile. And we've been asking people in our surveys, well, if you could live any way you wanted in Houston, what would you prefer? And here's my last thing I'm going to show you, then we'll stop, I promise. Alternating years, is a single-family residential area or an area with a mix of developments, including shops, workplaces, and restaurants. If you could live in any kind of area, what would you prefer? That's in 3 different years, and it's a 50-50 split in the city of Houston, in the Harris County, Texas, where nobody lives in an area with a mix of developments. And then if you could live in any kind of home, what would you prefer? A single-family house with a big yard where you need to drive everywhere you want to go, or a smaller, more urbanized home within walking distance of shops to improve rail and buses? And you get, again, a 50-50 split. This is a city in the process of reinventing itself. You guys did this in Los Angeles 15, 20 years ago. Houston is at the cusp of this whole rethinking of how do we position this city for success in the very different world of the 21st century. And it's striking what's going on. And part of this is, of course, traffic is getting worse and worse, right? We all know that. There's no way, you can't build enough roads to handle all the new traffic that's coming. Someone said they're trying to solve your traffic problems by building more roads. It's like trying to deal with your weight problem by buying a bigger pair of pants. It doesn't help very much. It relieves you for a little while, but you're still getting fat. So it's this process of a city kind of rethinking what it needs to be. And we are a different folk today. We all went out to the suburbs in the 60s and 70s when 2/3 of all American families had children living at home. Today, less than 1/3 of all households have any children at home. Whole bunches of us are empty nesters. The kids have grown up. I'm in my late 40s, early 50s. I work downtown. I love the ballet and the symphony. I just don't want to have to drive 2 hours every day. Give me a choice, Houston. And then large numbers of you guys, of the young creatives, coming into the city, the people we're most trying to attract for the new industries, in no hurry to get married, to have children, to turn us into grandparents. Young folks don't want to be out in the suburbs. They want the variety, the diversity that is the city of Houston. And the census thinks that by 2020, there will be more American households consisting of a single person living alone than households with children at home. Single people don't want to be out there in the suburbs. And the fastest growing age segment of the American population are men and women over the age of 85, growing more rapidly than any other segment of the population. And we have not seen anything yet as the baby boom heads off into that status. I'm not sure we want all 85-year-olds having to drive everywhere they want to go, right? So there's a new rethinking that's going on here. And the other thing is this. This is downtown Houston, believe it or not, east of Main Street in 1978. That's what downtown Houston looked like. Surface parking, land speculators buying up the land, waiting for the price to get right. 4 years later comes a total collapse of the economy in the oil boom collapse. The only thing anyone can recognize here is that freeway, that's 59 coming from the airport. And that building, Houston House, is still going to be there. I'm going to show you now exactly the same picture 33 years later. Wow, right? Suddenly there's a downtown. Suddenly there's an urban place. Houston is reinventing itself for the 21st century. So let me stop there and remind us of these 3 great themes, right? It's a new economy where education becomes critical. With all my optimism about Houston, I am deeply worried about our absolute inadequacy of the efforts to prepare the next generation, especially the Latinos and African Americans, who would be 70% of all of us, to prepare them for the jobs of the 21st century. It is the critical challenge facing America and facing especially cities like Los Angeles and New York. And then, of course, this remarkable opportunity to build a truly successful, inclusive, equitable, united, multi-ethnic society. All of us minorities, all of us called on to build the new America of the 21st century. And then in Houston's case, but also LA's, we're pretty sure another 1 million people are going to move into the city of Houston in the next 20 years. Another 3 million will be coming into the greater Houston metropolitan area. Can we build a city that will be more green, more healthy, more beautiful, more attractive, with another 1 million people in it than today, only if we figure out a way to guide that growth, right? And Houston has no zoning, so we don't have the key mechanism that cities use to control planning. But the big slogan in Houston these days is, no zoning doesn't mean no planning. And there's all kinds of planning efforts in the city now, as we recognize this is the challenge, and we've got to do it now. We've got to make sure that we accommodate that new growth in a way that enhances rather than leads to further deterioration of the quality of life in the city. So I tell people, wow, what a fascinating city to be a sociologist in. I mean, you just sort of see this coming together, these sets of forces that are shaping, I think, all of America, but nowhere more sharply articulated, more clear than in our 2 cities, Los Angeles and Houston, that are really where the American future is going to be taking shape in the 21st century. Thank you all very much.
When you're a professor, you're a performer, right? And when you move to a new city, you're always looking for the laugh lines, right? So I have two of them now. One is this one works. You get a simultaneous laughter, and people are terrified. I'm from LA, and I think your traffic sucks. That's what I tell them in Houston, because LA is the traffic future of Houston. I moved to LA in '81. My recollection is the rush hour just got longer and longer and longer until it simply evaporated, right? Or it consumed, and that's kind of the way it is now. The other one is, you look at the growth patterns and you say, okay, there's nothing stopping Houston from sprawling to the Rockies, right? As you said. And it's interesting that about half the people in Houston are horrified by that, and the other half would think it would be really cool to have mountains in Houston. Although it would be more the Houston way to just build them, right? Without an environmental impact report, by the way. I forgot to mention that I thought I was the only middle-class person in Houston who does not own a car until I met Monty Large, right? And there is one other guy.
Stephen Fox, have you met him yet?
Stephen Fox, yes, right. I met one other guy. We had to meet at a dive bar at a light rail stop, of course, in order to be able to. So I think what you're seeing is Houston, in a certain way, following the trajectory of LA, right? My observation is LA really struggled with this question of, and I saw this in San Diego too, are we suburban or are we urban? And you saw that really, that tipping point really, I think, came in the 90s or maybe the early 2000s. Remember when Mayor Villagrosa all of a sudden started talking about elegant density? Like that was an okay thing to talk about?
Good density.
And he was elected in 2005. And I think I think it's a tougher sell in Houston for a couple of reasons. One is, as Steve said, there really are no geographical barriers at all. The only one is the Gulf. Right, that's really the only geographical barrier.
50 miles away.
Pardon?
50 miles
50
away.
miles away. Whereas LA bumped, another thing that happened in LA was you bumped up against your natural barriers, right, all over the place. Federal land, mountains, the ocean, and the Marines at Camp Pendleton, right, who protect, as we used to say, they protect San Diego from LA. As we used to say in San Diego. I do want to ask Steve a couple of questions. One is one about the survey itself, and then a little bit about, the first one is, can you talk a little bit about how the survey itself has changed over time? You've done a bunch of oversamples over the years on different things, but methodologically, when you think about survey research, how did it change over time? Did it get longer? Did you emphasize different things? Did you have to, over time, really think about calibrating the questions from year to year, that kind of thing? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, there are two big changes, right? One is, of course, we began back in 1982. I miss those years. That was when everyone had landlines. The phone rang. There was no caller ID, no answering machines. People answered the phone, and we got an 85% response rate. We answered the phone, and we could convince them to do this. Today, you're trying to get people to, the horrible things that they now have that stop, interfere with our efforts to penetrate households. So we have a falling response rates, as everybody does. We have a pretty good cooperation rate. If we can get someone to answer the telephone, we can persuade them pretty easily to do the survey. Part of it is now 34 years, so there's a vague sense that there's a Rice survey that's done every year, and we tell them the Chronicle is going to be carrying big front page stories of the findings in a couple of months, and how'd you get my number? We have a computer that gives us random phone numbers. You don't know who you are, where you live, but your views are really important. This family represents 1,500 households in the Houston area. It's a short, interesting questionnaire. Won't you help us? And so we get people to do it. But the problem is much lower response rates. And so, and now, of course, 35% of the interviews are done by cell phones, which has its own complications, right? Because you don't, the area code that you have is where you first got the phone, not where you now live. And so it's, but it's the only way you're going to get any kind of representation of younger folks and Latinos. And then, of course, we, like everyone else, now have to weight the survey. So we give extra, so you weight it in a systematic way to align the the basic demographics with what you know to be the realities of the demographics from the census, and that gives a little extra weight to younger Latinos and less weight to older Anglos, and it's still working. I tell people, I'm going to retire by the time the whole thing completely collapses, but it does work. And then the other answer is that we started out as an undergraduate course. And we did, and this incredible group of students that first year who did.
Everyone in Houston has been a Klineberg student, by the way. I don't know how 2 million people have taken your class over the years. In the days before the MOOC, right? But
I've been in Houston too long, I think. so and then we got this little competition between. In the old days, there were 2 daily newspapers in Houston: the Houston Post and the Houston Chronicle. And the Houston Chronicle or the Houston Post said, "We'll help support the survey if you give us worldwide exclusive first publication rights," which means we get it and the Chronicle doesn't. And so they provided some support. And then I started, as I got invited to give these talks about the findings to boards of banks and boards of different corporations, I'd say, "Okay, I'm coming, but will you make a tax-deductible contribution to Rice to help support the surveys?" And so out of that, we got more and more monies coming in that enable us to hire full-time professional interviewers and give the students more of a chance to think conceptually about what are the issues that they want to focus on and develop hypotheses and test them with the new data. So it's emerged, and then the rest is history. Then the Kinder Institute came along, and Bill is with us, which is just wonderful. And we're ready to make the next steps of the commitment that we all have is we have the elevator speech for the Kinder Institute is to do transparently reliable research, and then to use that research to inform and inspire the communities on which the research is based, to be a catalyst for informed decision making. And that's a big part of it.
And I think that is, particularly in the social sciences, a significant trend toward extremely applied research and connecting research to policy and to action. Yeah.
I got a question. When you do your survey and your data collection, living in New York, you see a lot of people that would appear to be African, they're very, very dark skinned, but yet they speak Spanish.
Right.
Right. You know what I mean? If you see them, you think they're from Nigeria, but when they speak, they hola, hola, you know what I mean? Yeah. How would you count them in a survey with the census? How do they is it shared, or is it like under the Latino or under the black?
Right. So the census asks those 2 questions. It says, "Are you Anglo-Black? Are you? What is your race first? And then are you Hispanic?" So there are Hispanics who can say, "I'm Black and Hispanic." And what we do, of course, we don't see people, right? We're on the phone. We say, "Are you Anglo-Black, Hispanic, Asian, or some other ethnic background?" If they say, "I'm several," we say, "Well, which one do you most strongly identify with?" If they still say several, we say, "Okay," and check them off as other.
It's mixed race.
But you're right. It's this whole new world. And I tell people the great challenge for the future of America is not an ethnic divide; it's a class divide. That's where that's the great question for what kind of a society are we going to build.
Okay. Also, one more. Based on the progress of this survey, how people go, who you think most likely to be extinct? I mean, I don't want nobody to be extinct. So based on that progress, 100 years, who's most likely out of the groups first to become maybe extinct?
Old white guys.
But there'll be some white guys, some white kids coming along.
Right.
But certainly the dominance of whites is going to be very different.
I wanted to make one other observation, ask Steve one other question, then we'll open it up to more questions. I want to hear, what you have to say. I want to hear what Dal has to say in particular. I want to talk a little bit about the political landscape of Houston, which is a little different than here. LA County is extremely Democratic, as you know. The outlying counties are mixed, I think is fair to say. My home county of Ventura County was a Republican majority from 1880 to 2010, but is now a Democratic majority registration again. Houston is about the same population as the Bay Area, to give you a context. This is an oversimplification, there's about 2 million people in the city of Houston. There's about 2 million other people in the central county, Harris County, and there's about 2 million other people elsewhere in the metro. That's an oversimplification, but it's more or less an order of magnitude correct. The city of Houston is reliably Democratic, although my observation would be that a successful Democratic politician in the city of Houston is pretty conservative and business-oriented by California standards. The county is reliably Republican, although the county judge, the elected county executive, is pretty close to a rhino, interestingly enough. And there is this strong suburban feel. So there's kind of a tension between the emerging urban area and the suburban area. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, Steve, what is it going to, and HJC, which is the Houston equivalent of SCAG, is about to adopt a 2040 transportation plan in which something like 1% of the transportation investment is inside the 610 loop, which is the urban part of the region, and a vast majority of it is building the third ring around Houston.
Yes.
So I'm just kind of wondering, from your perspective, Steve, what's it going to take for the politics of metropolitan Houston to change so that it catches up with the increasingly urban reality that you lay out?
Great. Yeah, well, I tell people, there's a big distinction between public opinion, which is what we're doing, asking people in the privacy of their homes, how do you see the world, and politically effective opinion. Who votes? Who controls the political apparatus? Who contributes to campaigns? Who gets listened to? Who establishes the agenda? And so the paradox, you can see it especially in Houston, but everywhere else as well, is that the general public is far more progressive, far more in support, for example, of rational immigration policy, far less worried about what's happening to America than what comes out in the politics. And that's going to be very interesting to see. So the story in America is that Republican voters tend to vote much more than Democratic voters. One of the things I remind people, Texas is about to become, we think, a battleground state. It's not there yet. It's still the most red state in the union. There's not a single Democrat in statewide office.
And not a single Democrat who even came close in the election.
And even worse, they thought there'd be some progress.
I'd rather be a Republican in California than a Democrat in Texas. That's how bad it is.
Yeah. But there's the growth of the population and the growth of the electorate is going to be more in the Democratic camp. So
now I think you said last night when we were talking that, so Houston, Metro Houston ethnic makeup is not that different from LA, 40 some odd percent Latino. Mm-hmm. And yet I think you said something like Latinos in Texas or in Houston vote at half the rate that they vote in California.
Yeah, Latinos in Texas vote at half the rate of Latinos in California.
And if they voted at the same rate as in California, Texas would certainly be at least a purple state, right?
So that's a Democratic challenge. And the Republican challenge is to find a way to appeal to what is to some degree a natural constituency for them, constituency.
Or suppress the voter turnout. Which is what they did in the last election.
And try not to alienate your base, which is the other key.
Right.
But the key thing is that in California, there's a vigorous Democratic Party that has reached out to Democratic constituents. Texas has had a moribund Democratic Party for 30 years. And these are folks who will vote when they're encouraged to, when there's given a reason to, and will not if not. And so it's going to be fascinating to watch both. And then the other big sign of all this is that if the Republicans ever lose Texas, there's virtually no pathway to the White House, because they're not going to win California, they're not going to win New York. Increasingly, it looks like they're not going to win Virginia or Florida. If you don't get the Texas electoral votes, it's very tough.
You got no chance.
Very tough to get there. So both parties know that. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
I'm wondering, Dowell, if you could give us a thought or two about and you've lived in Texas, used to teach at UT in Austin. Yeah. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your thoughts about the comparisons between LA and Houston based on what Steve has said.
Well, it's clear that in Houston there's a lot more romance going on.
The one other question they didn't ask was how many of you had romantic relationships with people from different ethnic backgrounds at the same time?
I had to ask an ethnographical question on that issue. I mean, first off, your survey results are so fascinating, so detailed. But what possessed you to put in the romance question? The Census Bureau never asked that. The Pew Hispanic doesn't ask that, and PPIC, they're a sober government place. They don't ask that. Why did you ask that?
That was a great insight. It was a great inspiration.
It was actually Jennifer Bratter, a good friend of Juliet's, who is studying mixed race experiences, and said, ask a question about interracial.
Her idea?
So it was her idea.
Jennifer Bratter is a sociology professor at Rice.
And you suckered for it.
So I said, that's right, and it turned out to be a really interesting question.
The assimilation that we
Of course.
government data.
The census has something of that. Well, the census has,
They don't
and they don't ask about
They don't
the.
have a romantic relationship.
But they ask about the race of your spouse, don't they? So you have, at least you have that. But thank you. I know it's been great.
But I have to wonder from your data also that what would attract Bill Fulton to want to move there. And I see obviously it has to do with urban sprawl and the split vote that you show on urban sprawl. It's a fascinating.
Yeah, Bill said that 10 years ago people would have told you don't take this job.
Right. People did tell me 10 years ago I would have told you not to take this job.
Yeah.
Well, I find it fascinating, as I said, when you're talking about as I said, the MPO is about to adopt this regional transportation plan, which is basically all sprawl all the time, and yet Steve's survey has found consistently in the region that the population is split half and half, and actually TTI did a survey last fall which aggregated a bigger area around Houston, not just the metro, but came out with a more or less order of magnitude same conclusion. So you got to wonder, at what point do the decision makers in Metro Houston actually start to reflect the preferences of the people who actually live there, and contrast that to here, where the pushback I got as a planning consultant and as a policy advisor, as a policymaker for 20 years was you're out ahead of us. You're trying to spend too much money on transit. Kind of the opposite point.
But following up on that very thought, though, Bill, I mean, and the question for Steve is, why didn't you show us those opinions broken down by race? You didn't do it.
I could have. I don't.
Do we have the end for that?
Sure, of course. Yeah, sure.
The whites are more skewed to the sprawl, and the blacks and Latinos are more favoring.
There was a young professor at UT Public Health, Casey Duran, who went here for Ph.D. in preventative medicine, using Steve's data to try to determine whether there is a match between where people actually live, what kind of neighborhood they actually live in, and what their actual neighborhood preferences, and whether those mostly align or mostly don't align or what. So I think there's a lot more you could do with that on this stuff. I've thought about that.
And in the survey this year that's just underway, we asked not only what your own preference, but does this describe your actual neighborhood today or not? And so that's going to be interesting.
Straight up.
I had questions on that line. I mean, not knowing Houston a whole lot, other than the fact that Houston is known for the covenants. They didn't have any zoning, but they have the covenants.
Right.
That's protected the
rich.
And
Most of
originally racist. But
Right, of course.
So what is going on? I mean, first of all, does Houston have neighborhoods? Are they segregated? Is there a mixing going on? What is sociology? So what is the social ecology of Houston, and how is it changing?
Because it's so spread out, Houston is the most segregated city by income. So you live in co-ethnic enclaves, right? Made up of what the Wall Street Journal used to call PLUs, people like us. And it's more in Houston than elsewhere because there's more choices to do that. One of the things that predicts interest in moving downtown is younger folks. And so that's good, and they are also far more comfortable with diversity. And so that's an interesting thing, and there's gentrification that's coming rapidly. In that part I showed you, that east side of Main Street, there's that development, but right past that is just, again, open spaces and waiting to be, where poor people are living, and can we accommodate this gentrification without resulting in the displacement of the poor? And there's a chance to do that in Houston because there's empty spaces down there. So but that's a great challenge.
I would observe about there's a lot of similarities that I think play to that. If I look at Houston, I can see that there's big job centers that are spread around. So I look at Houston and I see, okay, here's the Warner Center, here's the Century City, right? Here's the Irvine. But in addition to that, because it's spread out, like LA, it's a different kind of segregation than you traditionally think of when you think of the black-white South. Now, you're quite right that Houston is an old black-white Southern city, but in a Southern city in the days of Jim Crow, segregation meant people in a small town, particularly if you think of To Kill a Mockingbird, people live very close to one another of different races, and so therefore they felt you had to have an extremely strict structure to keep them separated from one another in this small space. In Houston and LA both, I think the difference is they're they're so big that each race traditionally had a large area that was theirs, right? And so you didn't exactly need that kind of, although I assume Houston was a Jim Crow city in some ways, you didn't really need that kind of strict set of social structures. And if you ever want to understand a little bit about the African-American relationship between LA and Houston, read Walter Mosley. Because if you remember, anybody ever read Devil in a Blue Dress? Okay, E.Z. Rawlins grows up in the 5th Ward in Houston. That's where he and Mouse got into trouble. And he gets into trouble and he moves to South Central, and Mouse follows him. And there's all this stuff about he doesn't want to live his life from the 5th Ward in South Central. It's a pretty useful sociological insight into the traditional African-American neighborhoods in Houston and LA. How long we got?
About time for one more question.
One more question.
Okay.
One more? No more questions. One more. Dowell gets the last.
Not really.
You're allowed to not ask a question. You're a tenured professor.
So you said this interesting comparison with LA and Houston. But I just want to say that, Steve, I think it's a little unfair how you did it. Because it makes LA look bad. You have this great data on Houston, and we don't have anything that can match that. And the story you tell, the demographic
Get with it, he
transformation,
says.
ignited by an oil crash, is better than our story of the 1990s. You know, aerospace crash.
Right.
It was dramatic. And then you have all the romance in there too. So you had extra dimensions that makes Houston look pretty good.
And that is why we are taking the Kinder Institute story to throughout the world to make Houston look good compared to LA and other cities.
Hey, thank you
Thanks
all
for
very
having
much.
us.